Danny Frank for GNAT TV. I saw a very impressive review in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago by a lady named Ruth. The author of the book was Ruth Franklin, who happens to be from Brooklyn, who wrote this book about another writer, another author who actually lived in North Bennington, Vermont. So I felt that I had to have Ruth Franklin on our show to discuss her new book published by W.W. Norton. It's called Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. And Ruth Franklin, welcome to Manchester and to Northshire Books. And I know you're also going to be at the Park McCullough House too. Welcome to Vermont.
Thank you very much. Vermont is a beautiful state, and I'm very happy to be here.
So, Ruth Franklin, commercially, in terms of relevance, Shirley Jackson is hardly a well-known or prominent historical figure. Say she's not in the category of authors like some of her other contemporaries, like a Pearl Buck or a John Steinbeck or a Norman Mailer. A couple of quick examples. I mean, doesn't have that same celebrity or fame or prominence. So, what motivated you to this big book on Shirley Jackson?
Well, it's funny you say that, because certainly in terms of her whole body of work, I suppose she doesn't have the same kind of name recognition as some of the people you mentioned. But she does have a unique distinction, which is that her short story, The Lottery, has been one of the most popular, most frequently anthologized stories in all of American fiction. If you went to high school in America after the early 1950s or so, chances are you encountered The Lottery. It was published in the New Yorker in June 1948, and the magazine received more letters in response to that story than they ever had before in reaction to any other work of fiction. So she certainly was a sensation of her time, not only for The Lottery, but also for her two best-selling memoirs about her life as a mother. She was the mother of 4 children, and she wrote comic stories about her household, her absent-minded professor husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, who was a literary critic at Bennington College. And these started off as magazine articles for very popular women's magazines like Good Housekeeping and Women's Home Companion. And then she collected her magazine articles into these memoirs, which were best-selling. And it actually was a story from one of those memoirs that first got me thinking that I wanted to write the life of Shirley Jackson. I'll just tell you a little bit about the story. It's called The Third Baby's the Easiest, and she describes going to the hospital to give birth to her 3rd child. And as she's checking into the hospital, the clerk asks her to state her occupation. And she says, writer. And mind you, this was only a couple months after The Lottery had been published as such an enormous sensation. So she says, writer. And the clerk says, I'll just put down housewife. And to me, that story encapsulated so much about what it must have been like to be Shirley Jackson and to be a serious writer who also happened to be a mother and even sometimes might have defined herself as a housewife in the 1940s and 1950s, a time when it was so difficult for women in America to make that kind of choice, to have both a professional career and a life at home with children. So that's really what got me interested in writing this book.
Now, you say in one part of the book that Shirley Jackson was sort of the Jean Kerr or Irma Bombeck. There was an emerging generation of these mommy blog type mommy commentators that began to percolate, so to speak, culturally, and you say that Shirley Jackson fit into that.
Yeah, she definitely was a prototype of this kind of writing. She may even have initiated it. And what is so interesting, I think, and what I find so sympathetic about the way she writes about her children and her household is that it's very subtly subversive. You know, she doesn't play into the women's magazine attitude at the time that a woman had to be a perfect housewife and have a spotless house and run everything smoothly. She always depicts herself as kind of haphazard and discombobulated, and all the children are always running off in all directions, and she sometimes doesn't quite know where they've gone or when they're coming back. And her mother even criticized her for portraying her life in such a, what she called, a helter-skelter way in her stories, and was worried that people would look down on her for it. But in fact, I think that's what part of what made her household writings so popular, was that women looked at them and recognized them as a very realistic portrait of what it's like to have a household, with 4 rambunctious children.
You feel that Shirley Jackson was understated and she did not gain the recognition which you feel she was entitled to receive, and why not? And in your estimation, did she deserve greater prominence in her career and the afterlife period here?
Well, yes, I definitely feel that she was underrated for different reasons. Now, I say that, but at the same time, she had several best-selling novels. Her last novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, was nominated for the National Book Award. So it's not in any way as if she was unknown. And then, of course, her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, was made into a very well-known movie in 1963 called The Haunting with Claire Bloom. So many of her works have always been quite popular. But she never received the kind of critical academic recognition that I feel she deserved. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that she did write occasionally, not entirely, in genres that have been regarded as less serious than, for instance, the great American novel. The Haunting of Hill House is a kind of classic ghost story. It's not a simple ghost story. It's not really just a ghost story. It's quite psychologically complex, but in many ways, it's a classic haunted house story. And of course, she had her memoirs about the children, which also are a genre not generally taken seriously by critics. But I think another part of the problem with Shirley Jackson's reputation is that her writing was almost entirely focused on women's lives. You can count the number of male protagonists in her stories or her novels literally on one hand. She simply didn't write about male characters. And the critical conversation in her time was dominated by men. Virtually all the critics who reviewed her novels were men. And I believe they simply weren't inclined to take the stories of women as seriously as they took works by some of the other authors you mentioned.
So does Shirley Jackson's writing, her articles for periodicals like the New Yorker or her books, have they developed shelf life where people follow them or read them, or she's got a cult following of fans, or are they taught? Are they taught in schools?
Mm-hmm. Well, The Lottery, yes, is still taught in schools, as is We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And Shirley Jackson has a devoted following, especially among other writers. Many, many writers I've met have told me that they see her as a kind of a model, or a godmother figure of sorts. Writers as different as Stephen King even has talked about The Haunting of Hill House as one of his models for his own work. Neil Gaiman, the very popular fantasy writer, also admires Shirley Jackson, and many other literary writers as well have spoken of her as someone they emulate.
Ruth Franklin, I mentioned the Wall Street Journal review at the start of the show, and I also want to point out there are numerous reviews for this book, quite good. There's one Boston Globe excerpt here, a fresh look at one of our most underrated writers, as well as a portrait of her mid-century milieu, and the writer's block, the big literary biography of the season, years in the making. How long did it take you to do this project?
It was indeed years in the making. It was about 6 years from start to finish.
Really?
For a literary biography, that's actually not unusual at all.
Yeah. I mean, what are your emotions or feelings as you go through that process? Is it frustration, or do you ever say to yourself, maybe I took on the wrong project, or
it was really an amazing project. I felt absorbed in it and in Shirley Jackson's life from start to finish. A lot of it, I won't lie to you, a lot of it was somewhat tedious archival work, working in Jackson's archive, which is housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. A wonderful place to do research. But her archive is about 50 boxes of papers. Everything from drafts of her novels to newspaper clippings, even diet logs and dream diaries that she left behind, all kinds of stuff. And of course, many, many letters. She seems to have been the kind of person who didn't throw anything away. So there just was a treasure trove of stuff there, much of which had never been really gone through in a comprehensive way by any other researcher. And her husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, has his own archive at the Library of Congress that's about the same size. So that work alone was enough to keep me very, very busy. And then as the project went on, I actually came upon a number of different stashes of their correspondence held privately by the heirs of people they had corresponded with, which is such a thrill to see letters that haven't been looked at in maybe decades. But I did find the archival work really, really absorbing. One thing that's wonderful about writing biography is that if you get tired of one aspect of the project, you can simply move on to another. So if I did get tired of the archive work, I could interview somebody who knew Jackson, or one of Stanley Hyman's former students. I interviewed dozens of people for this book. Or I could do some detective work and file a FOIA request for Stanley Edgar Hyman's FBI files, which was another component that went into this book. I think biography is a wonderful form because it allows you to exercise so many different parts of your brain, and I never found it boring at all.
A future biography? Any thoughts or?
Well, not yet. Right now, I'm just concentrating on getting out the word about Shirley Jackson. So,
you make the point how Shirley Jackson came from very well-to-do family in California, and being out in her family orientation in California, how did she wind up in North Bennington, Vermont?
That's right. She was born in San Francisco and raised in Burlingame, California, a very well-to-do suburb. Her family came to the Northeast when she was a senior in high school, when her father, who was a printing company executive, was transferred from San Francisco to Rochester, New York. And at first she hated the Northeast, and in fact she even was allergic to it. She developed hay fever that had never plagued her in California. And she missed California for the rest of her life. She always pined, especially for the fruits. The produce was something that she always remembered, the pomegranates that could be bought for 2 for a nickel, she said, in those days. But she actually never went back. She stayed in the Northeast for the rest of her life, went to Syracuse University, which is where she met Stanley Hyman. Then the two of them lived in New York City for a very brief period of time before Stanley was offered a job at Bennington College. And they moved to North Bennington then. And aside from a very brief foray to Westport, Connecticut, which only lasted a couple of years, they were in Vermont for the rest of their lives.
So it seems that Shirley's husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, he was sort of like an oddball. They were an oddball, peculiar couple. Her husband, as you said, taught at Bennington College, but didn't seem to have anywhere near the personality, the same personality, much different, right?
Well, they were definitely, I think, an attraction of opposites. She was a WASP from California. He was a Brooklyn Jew. She, of course, was a creative writer. He was a critic. In many ways, these characteristics complemented each other. I think from the day that they met when he read a story of hers in a college literary magazine and resolved that he was going to find the author of the story and marry her. So from that moment on, Stanley saw himself as the great critic who is going to explain Shirley Jackson's genius to the world. And she had always felt like an outsider, ostracized by her family for not quite fitting in with their very kind of upper crust ways. She didn't want to be the kind of socialite debutante that her mother hoped she would be as a teenager. And so she really gravitated, I think, to the aspects of Stanley's personality that set him apart. He was a Jew, he was a communist when they met. He was quite unconventional, and it certainly was a very unconventional choice for a woman like her to marry someone like him. And in North Bennington itself, of course, they also felt sort of on the outskirts of the community. As as a Jew, she deeply identified with that aspect of his character. They even considered themselves a Jewish family, which of course was unusual in North Bennington. They were a strange pair in many ways, but one that was also strangely complementary.
But yet we're talking about a period where, of course, there was no internet and even television back in the early 50s was in its infancy, and certainly
she
didn't
writes
have
with
the
excitement about getting her first television.
Yeah, so I mean, communication was much different, and interface with people was much different back then than it is today. So maybe that influenced some of their presence here.
Yeah,
right?
Well, it's good for the biographer, certainly, that communication was different because of all these letters left behind. It's hard to imagine what the analog will be for future biographers of people in our time.
Ruth Franklin, did Shirley Jackson have the prominence locally as, say, some of her contemporaries up here in southern Vermont at that time, like Norman Rockwell or Dorothy Canfield Fisher, who was another author around that time, or Pearl Buck?
She did not, actually. She kept a pretty low profile around Bennington. Now, remember, at Bennington, she basically was considered a faculty wife. It was Stanley Hyman who was really the center of things intellectually. They were part of a circle of writers around Bennington College that included the literary critic Kenneth Burke, the poet Howard Nemeroff, Bernard Malamud, the fiction writer, all of whom were at Bennington in those years. But Jackson, in her private life, actually, she was known as Mrs. Stanley Hyman. So many of her neighbors may not even have known that she was the writer Shirley Jackson. She simply, she shunned publicity. She hated to do interviews. She rarely appeared in newspaper profiles, for instance. She hated to have her picture taken and shown in the newspaper. So she really did keep quite a low profile.
So did that stunt her commercial success, or her ability to maybe make money and a living off of
Not
what
at all,
she?
actually.
No?
She was quite commercially successful, and in fact, she was the family breadwinner for almost all of her career. This writing, especially the writing that she did for women's magazines, was quite lucrative, and that was, in fact, one of the big surprises for me of researching this biography, was to see just how much magazine writers were paid back in those days. I mean, Jackson could sell a personal essay to a women's magazine for $2,000, and for $2,000 in the early 1960s, you could buy a small car.
Sure.
So it's sobering as a magazine writer today to see how much things have changed.
Shirley Jackson had children, and what is their status at present? Are they involved at all in their mother's legacy, and are they local here in
Yes, she
southern
had four
Vermont?
children, all fairly close in age, 3 years apart. They are all still alive. Two of them live in and around Bennington, Vermont still, and the other two live in California. But they're all in different ways involved in their mother's legacy. In fact, two of them last year edited and published a new book of Shirley Jackson's previously uncollected writings.
So what influence remains in North Bennington of Shirley Jackson? I mean, is her home site something that would be visited, or by fans, or?
I'd say Shirley Jackson still keeps a pretty low profile in North Bennington. Her fans do know where her house is, but there's no plaque on it saying Shirley Jackson lived here, or Shirley Jackson wrote the lottery here, or anything that you might expect. Although I've heard that there is a local movement to change that. So I'm very interested to see if anything will come of that.
So are you leading that campaign?
I'm not, actually.
No.
Somebody in North Bennington is.
So, Ruth Franklin, this is your second book, book published by W.W. Norton. And the two books you've written so far appear to be on subjects where you set the record straight, so to speak, or writing works that have a critical edge to them, or puts up a challenge as to what has maybe been previously reported or said. Like your other book that you wrote about the Holocaust, I think, right?
That's right. My first book is called A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in the Holocaust Fiction. It's a book of literary criticism about Holocaust literature, inspired by the spate of false memoirs that started to appear, I guess, around 10 or 15 years ago. And the credulousness with which all these false memoirs were initially accepted by the literary and academic establishments, which then, of course, were embarrassed when these books were debunked. And I started asking myself the question, well, why were people so easily fooled? Why were they so gullible? And I came to see that there had been kind of an abdication of critical response when it came to Holocaust writing. People seemed, that there was an attitude as if Holocaust literature was considered beyond criticism. It wasn't even allowed to practice, the normal types of literary analysis or interpretation on these works. They were simply accepted as some kind of, almost holy or religious documentation. And I felt that was really, a harmful impulse. Number one, because it had led to so much possible deception. But number two, because it failed to acknowledge that all the works we think of as canonical works of Holocaust literature are literary products. They're the products of very skilled writers who crafted them into literary texts. They're not simply spontaneous memoirs that were handed down by some process that seems sort of extra literary or unartistic in some way.
In terms of reporting on the Holocaust, would you consider these lies versus embellishment or exaggeration or distortion?
Well, the subtitle was meant to be sort of deliberately provocative. I don't really mean lies. What I mean actually is literature and fiction. And what I tried to show is the way that even writers like Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, in their Holocaust memoirs, use literary devices to tell their stories. They're not the literal truth. Now, does that mean that they're not true? Of course not. I would never want to give any kind of credence to Holocaust deniers. But the point of my book was simply to show that these are literary texts.
Ruth Franklin, you've written two books that have enjoyed some attention and traction, and again, very good reviews. And being an author today of books is much different than, say, 25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Where do you see your career as an author going, given the new economics of reading and books today, and the way in which books are presented in a high-tech world?
Well, high-tech world aside, it does look to me as if people are still reading books and still buying them. So I hope to continue writing books as long as there are readers out there.
Well, Ruth Franklin from Brooklyn, New York, the book about Shirley Jackson. It's called A Rather Haunted Life, and Ruth again Shirley did write horror stories, right? I mean,
a share of horror stories.
And this book is published by W.W. Norton. Again, it's gotten some excellent criticisms and reviews, and thank you for being our guest on our show.
Pleasure.
So this is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.
Told my boys that I found the best woman around. She's so sweet to my